So if you have read Genesis from beginning to end, then you will know that the birth of Isaac in chapter 21 is a huge event. Abraham is introduced in chapter 12, and God calls him to go west to the land of Canaan. And part of that is God promises Abraham that he will be a great nation. And let's be honest, it's hard to be a great nation if you don't have any children. So for 9 chapters, we keep expecting Abraham to have a son. You needed a son in the ancient world to pass on your inheritance. But no son has been born to Abraham and Sarah. Now, 2 times, Abraham and Sarah try to help God out. It's almost like they're saying, maybe God doesn't know how this great nation thing works. So first, Abraham suggests, how about the head of my household? How about Eliezer? He can be the one through whom this great nation is started. And then Sarah suggests that Abraham sleep with her servant Hagar. And Hagar does, in fact, produce a son whom she names Ishmael. But with both of these, God says, no, thanks for the help, but Abraham and Sarah, you two are going to have a son together. And it's through that child, Isaac, who this great nation will be formed. So in the reading for today, after this son has been born, now that we're in Genesis 21, we might expect this to focus on the relationship of Abraham and Isaac, and talking about how Abraham teaches Isaac to live into this role of being a great nation. But interestingly, the story is all about Hagar and Ishmael, and it is that passage that we're going to look at today. Will you please join with me in prayer? Gracious God, be our teacher today. We ask that your Spirit would guide us and enable us to see and to hear your word. Help us as we listen to this marvelous story about how you hear us. We ask this in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. Hear now the word of the Lord from Genesis chapter 21, verses 8 through 21. The boy, and the boy is Isaac, grew and stopped nursing. On the day he stopped nursing, Abraham prepared a huge banquet. Sarah saw Hagar's son laughing, the one Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham. So she said to Abraham, "Send this servant away with her son. The servant's son won't share the inheritance with my son Isaac." This upset Abraham terribly because the boy was his son. God said to Abraham, "Don't be upset about the boy and your servant. Do everything Sarah tells you to do, because your descendants will be traced through Isaac. But I will make of your servant's son a great nation too, because he is also your descendant." Now Abraham got up early in the morning, took some bread and a flask of water, and gave it to Hagar. He put the boy in her shoulder sling and sent her away. She left and wandered through the desert near Beersheba. Finally, the water in the flask ran out, and she put the boy down under one of the desert shrubs. She walked away from him about as far as a bow shot and sat down, telling herself, "I can't bear to see the boy die." She sat at a distance, cried out in grief, and wept. God heard the boy's cries, and God's messenger called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "Hagar, what's wrong? Don't be afraid. God has heard the boy's cries over there. Get up, pick up the boy, and take him by the hand, because I will make him a great nation." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well. She went over, filled the water flask, and gave the boy a drink. God remained with the boy. He grew up, lived in the desert, and became an expert archer. He lived in the Paran desert, and his mother found him an Egyptian wife. This is the word of the Lord. So as we were reading this story, you may have found that you identify more with Sarah, or maybe you find you identify more with Hagar. But I do think that if we had our choice, most of us would rather be Sarah. Names mean a lot in the Old Testament, and Sarah's name means something like princess. So maybe we don't envy Sarah's inability to give birth for so much of her life, but we might not mind having Sarah's status or privilege. Abraham and Sarah had a lot of servants, so we can presume that they were pretty wealthy. We might imagine that if Abraham and Sarah lived in Los Angeles, they might live in a beautiful Mediterranean-style house up in the Hollywood Hills, landscaped gardens, beautiful pool, view of the Pacific Ocean. Hagar, on the other hand, her name means something like foreigner, or alien, or outsider. Hagar might live in a 300-square-foot studio apartment with Ishmael in East LA or Belmont. Maybe she has to take the metro and 3 different buses to get to her job as Sarah's servant. Now, Hagar and Ishmael are at a precarious point in their lives, but Abraham and Sarah are at a precarious point in their faith. For most of their lives, Abraham and Sarah have had to throw themselves on the mercy of God, trusting that he would actually provide this son that we've kept expecting for 9 chapters. And having a son, we might say, what is this obsession they have with having a son? It was a big deal in the ancient world. I would say having a son is a lot like having a job is for us today. And you might be thinking, well, you said Sarah and Abraham were wealthy. They were, but let's be honest, having a job is about more than wealth, isn't it? And here's what I mean. Imagine you get invited to go to an Oscar party, one of your friends' houses, and you're watching the Oscars, and you notice there's a lot of people there who you don't know. What's one question you're inevitably going to get asked? What do you do? Your job is a way of identifying who you are for us. And a son had that function in the ancient world. It was tied to your identity, your son. And a job for us is also tied to security, right? If we have a job, the future isn't quite as scary because we can invest in retirement plans, we can invest in insurance. The possibility for Abraham's name, for his identity to continue for generations, which is a big deal in the ancient world, was dependent on having a son. And a son was responsible for caring for you when you were too old to care for yourself. So the ancient world's equivalent to a Roth IRA was a son. But now they have one. Their future is secure. His identity is secure. He has the dream job. He has the 3,000 square foot house with the white picket fence, and life, it feels secure. But it's precisely in these moments of security that it can be easy to forget how desperately dependent we are on God. Now, we aren't any less dependent on God, of course, but we can create an illusion that we are because we can more easily buy our way out of problems, whether that is by having access to good medical care or something else, a good retirement plan. Now, I'm not saying that medical care or a retirement plan is a bad thing in and of themselves. I'm merely saying that they can be ways that we deceive ourselves into thinking that we can secure our future or control our future. Now, another danger of being secure is that it can make us fearful of losing that security. So rather than fearing God, we fear losing our perfect life. When everything is perfect, we will do almost anything to protect that perfection. And I wonder if this is what's happened with Sarah. She gets angry at Ishmael because he laughs. Now, we're not told why Ishmael laughs. It might have been he was laughing derisively at Sarah, or he was laughing derisively at Isaac. I don't know. It also could have been he was just laughing because he was a kid. Frankly, I don't think it matters. I can't think of a possible reason that someone would be justified in sending out a child and her servant mother out to their almost certain death. Period. But for Sarah, life is good and it is secure, so she will do whatever she can to protect that security. So maybe we identify with Sarah, who has a lot to lose. Our greatest fear is losing the job that we have worked so hard to attain, our beautiful dream home burning down, or maybe it's losing a child or a spouse or a friend to an untimely death. Now, these aren't necessarily bad things, again, to be concerned about in themselves, but how far will we go to protect them? How much anxiety and worry will we put towards those things? And I think in the very next chapter, when God asks Abraham to sacrifice Sarah's only son, I think Sarah painfully realizes that her security is only an illusion because there's no insurance company that can guarantee she will never lose the thing that she loves most dearly. Or maybe we identify with Hagar. She's on the completely opposite end of the spectrum. She and Ishmael are now left for dead. So where Abraham and Sarah may be tempted to trust their security, their perfect life, Hagar has no one, nothing to trust, right, other than God. But that doesn't mean that Hagar will trust God. In fact, it would be just as easy for Hagar to blame God. In fact, in chapter 16, God promised Hagar that her son would be a great nation. Now, Hagar may be thinking, well, this is what I get for trusting God, because it doesn't look like God is going to follow through on this promise. Hagar and her son are hours from death. And maybe when we hear this story about God showing up for Sarah, or even showing up at the end for Hagar, we think, well, that's great, but where was God when I got laid off? Where was God when I lost my house? Where was God when my spouse left? When my child, when my father was in the hospital? And I have to say that the author of Genesis doesn't tell us that. The author of Genesis doesn't tell us why God shows up in the ways we hope for sometimes, and not in the ways that we want other times. But the story does tell us that God is a God who hears our cries, just as God heard Ishmael's cries. In fact, I can't think of a more profound picture of grace, because we're not told that Hagar prayed the right way, or that she fasted correctly, or that she read her Bible 30 minutes a day, 7 days a week. All we are told is that Hagar and Ishmael were totally and completely helpless. There was nothing that they could do to save themselves from their hopeless situation. And yet God rescued them. Our God is a God who hears the outsiders and who hears us in our desperation. But now what about Sarah? Sarah created a mess, right, by having her servant sleep with her husband. Then she made it worse by banishing that servant and her son to an almost certain death. But despite all the horrible things she has done and that she can't take back and that maybe haunt her at night, Sarah also experiences the grace of God. God still includes Sarah in his plan of salvation. Her children will be Israel, God's chosen people. God probably should have banished Sarah like she banished Hagar. But instead, 1,000 years later, God sends his own son to endure the banishment that Sarah deserved and that we deserve when we live our lives trusting an illusion of security. But God includes Sarah in the story of salvation. In fact, it is Sarah's children who God calls the children of the promise. Friends, we worship a God who hears us when we are at our most desperate, and whom we desperately need even when we think we are at our most secure. We worship a God who, through his Son, Jesus Christ, heaps grace upon grace on us. Whether we are like Hagar, beaten down by life, or like Sarah, believing that we are secure and doing whatever we can to protect that illusion of security, God hears us, God loves us, and God gives grace to us. We, by no merit of our own, are the children of